I'm Monica Reed Caldwell, 36 years old, an emergency room nurse, and the mother of a little girl who was once treated as if she didn't belong in this family. I used to believe love could conquer everything, every judgmental glance, every veiled insult, every cold silence that fell the moment I entered a room. I turned a blind eye more times than I care to admit because I thought I was strong enough, because I believed my husband would shield us, because I hoped my daughter, whom I loved more than life itself, would never have to know pain. I was wrong. It wasn't until my sister-in-law's wedding the day my powerful mother-in-law handed out gold and pearls to her real grandchildren and gave my daughter a torn dress wrapped in newspaper that I understood. Some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. That was the day everything broke. And the day I chose to rise. Not for me, but for an 8-year-old girl who only wanted to be called granddaughter by her real name. I should have known something was wrong when Veronica Caldwell insisted on inspecting my wedding dress 3 days before the ceremony. Standing in that antebellum mansion on the Ashley River, watching her run her manicured fingers over my simple satin gown, I felt like a child being examined for fleas. "This is what you chose?" Her voice carried that particular Charleston drawl that could make even compliments sound like criticisms. For a Caldwell wedding? I was 33 years old, a registered nurse who had worked double shifts to pay for my own education, who had raised myself after my grandmother died when I was 16. I had faced down angry patients, helped deliver babies in emergency situations, and held the hands of dying strangers. But in that moment, standing in Ethan's childhood home with its oil paintings of Confederate generals staring down at me, I felt smaller than I had since I was 8 years old, and kids at school asked why my skin was that color. "It's beautiful, Monica," Ethan said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. His chin rested on my shoulder, and I could smell his familiar cologne mixed with the sweet tea he'd been drinking on the veranda. "You're beautiful." Veronica's laugh was like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "Of course she is, darling. I just thought. Well, the Caldwell women have worn Vera Wang for 3 generations. The wedding took place on a Saturday in June, Spanish moss dripping from ancient oaks like nature's own cathedral ceiling. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the way Ethan's eyes never left mine as I walked down the aisle. For a moment, I believed we had won. Love had conquered all the small slights, the carefully worded comments about my background, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Then came time for family photos. "Now let's get one of just the real family," Veronica announced, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn like she was calling servants to attention. I felt Ethan's hand tighten in mine. The photographer, a nervous young man who clearly wanted to disappear, looked between us uncertainly. "Mother." Ethan's voice held a warning I'd never heard before. "Oh, don't be silly, dear. Monica understands. One photo of the Caldwell bloodline for posterity. Monica can take some lovely shots with us afterward." Standing there in my simple satin dress, holding my bouquet of white roses that suddenly felt heavy as stones, I understood exactly what my grandmother had meant when she used to say some battles weren't worth fighting. But some victories weren't worth winning either. I stepped back, letting go of Ethan's hand. "Of course," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "I'll just wait over here." 3 years into our marriage, the silence in our house had grown so thick you could cut it with a knife. The fertility doctors had been kind but clear. "Sometimes there's no medical explanation," they said. "Sometimes bodies just don't cooperate with our dreams." I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I first brought up adoption. Ethan was reading a medical journal, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look exactly like his father. "I've been thinking," I said, smoothing one of his dress shirts across our bed, "about other ways to build our family." He looked up, and I saw something flicker across his face. Relief, maybe, or hope. "There's a little girl," I continued. "Lena. She's 6, been in foster care for 2 years. Her caseworker thinks we'd be a good match." What I didn't tell him was that I'd been volunteering at the children's home for months, reading stories to kids who flinched when adults raised their voices, who hoarded snacks in their pockets because they'd learned hunger was always possible. Lena had been the one who crawled into my lap during story time, her small fingers tracing the words in the book like she was memorizing them. "She's beautiful," I said, showing him the photo on my phone. Lena's dark eyes stared back at us, serious and hopeful in that way only children can manage. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took my hand. "If this is what you want," he said, "then it's what I want too." The paperwork took 6 months. 6 months of home visits and background checks and interviews where social workers asked about our support system. I never mentioned that my mother-in-law had stopped inviting us to Sunday dinners after I'd politely declined to join the Daughters of the Confederacy. When we brought Lena home on a Tuesday in October, she carried everything she owned in a plastic garbage bag. I had spent weeks preparing her room: pink walls, a bookshelf full of stories, a window seat where she could watch the birds in our backyard. But she chose to sleep on the floor next to our bed for the first month, like she was afraid we might disappear in the night. Veronica came to meet her granddaughter exactly once. "Her middle name will be Josephine," she announced, not asked, standing in our living room like she was inspecting a piece of furniture she might purchase. After my mother, Lena was playing with blocks in the corner, building towers and knocking them down, rebuilding them taller each time. She had been with us for 3 weeks, and she was just starting to laugh at Ethan's terrible dad jokes, just beginning to ask for second helpings at dinner. "Her name is Lena Rosa Caldwell," I said quietly. "Rosa was my grandmother's name." "I see." Veronica's smile could have frozen summer. "Well, we'll just have to agree to disagree about that." She never called Lena by name again. For 2 years, our daughter was the child, or her, or sometimes, when Veronica was feeling particularly generous, Monica's project. When Madeline Caldwell's wedding invitation arrived in May, addressed only to Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Caldwell, I almost threw it away without opening it. But Ethan found it on the kitchen counter and read it aloud over breakfast. "Adults-only celebration," he read, his voice carefully neutral. "How unusual for a family wedding." Lena was 8 now, tall for her age, with legs that seemed to grow longer every week. She was eating cereal and reading a book at the same time, a skill she'd mastered that never failed to amaze me. Her hair was pulled back in the 2 braids I'd learned to do from watching YouTube videos, and she wore the purple t-shirt with a unicorn on it that she'd picked out herself. "What's adults only?" she asked without looking up from her book. "It means some parties are just for grown-ups," Ethan said carefully. "Like when you and Mom watch scary movies?" "Something like that." I watched my daughter process this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance that broke my heart a little more each day. She had learned not to expect invitations, not to ask why her picture wasn't in Grandma Veronica's Christmas cards, not to wonder why she was never included in family gatherings. But this was different. This was Ethan's only sister getting married, and Lena was being deliberately excluded. "I'm calling Mother," Ethan said after Lena had gone upstairs to get ready for school. I listened to half of a conversation that lasted 20 minutes, watching my husband's jaw get tighter with each passing moment. "The other grandchildren are invited," he said when he hung up. "All of them. James is bringing his 3 boys, Sarah's bringing the twins. But apparently the venue has a strict policy about children at wedding receptions. Except for the children who are actually invited. Except for those, yes." We drove to Florida, anyway. All 3 of us. Lena had never seen the ocean, and watching her face light up as she ran into the waves made every uncomfortable moment worth it. We stayed at a different hotel, ate at different restaurants, made our own family celebration while the Caldwell clan gathered at their 5-star resort. But I should have known Veronica wouldn't let it slide. "Monica, dear," she said when we arrived at the rehearsal dinner, her voice honey, sweet and poison, sharp. "I wasn't expecting all of you." Lena was wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with white flowers that we'd bought special for the occasion. She had practiced her manners in the hotel room, reminding herself to say please and thank you, to keep her napkin in her lap, to ask to be excused before leaving the table. "Lena is part of our family," I said, my hand on my daughter's shoulder. "Of course she is," Veronica agreed, but her eyes were already scanning the room. "I just think she might be more comfortable at the children's table. With the catering staff's children, they've set up something special in the kitchen area." The morning of Madeline's wedding, Lena woke up excited. She had been to exactly 3 weddings in her 8 years. Ours, which she'd seen only in photos, and 2 others where she'd been flower girl for friends of mine who understood that families come in all shapes and colors. "Will there be dancing?" she asked, spinning around our hotel room in her dress. "Lots of dancing," Ethan promised, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "And I'll dance with both my girls." The ceremony was beautiful in that effortless way that money can buy. White roses everywhere, a string quartet, bridesmaids in blush pink silk that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Lena sat between Ethan and me, swinging her legs and whispering questions about why the bride was crying if she was happy. Everything fell apart during the reception. It started with the gifts. Veronica, in her role as matriarch, had brought presents for all the grandchildren. Beautiful, expensive things wrapped in silver paper with elaborate bows. The other children gathered around her chair like she was the queen holding court, which, in that moment, she was. "Caroline, this is for you, darling," she said, handing an enormous box to James's oldest daughter. Inside was a child-sized pearl necklace, real ones, the kind that would be passed down for generations. The twins received matching gold bracelets. The boys got watches, actual working watches, with their names engraved on the back. Lena waited patiently, hands folded in her lap like I'd taught her, eyes bright with anticipation. "And this," Veronica said, her voice carrying across the reception hall, "is for the little girl." She handed Lena a bundle wrapped in newspaper, actual newspaper, like something you'd use to line a birdcage. Inside was a dress, but not any dress. It was stained, torn at the seams, the kind of thing you'd find in a donation bag that even Goodwill might reject. The table went silent. Even the band seemed to pause between songs. "What did I do wrong, Grandma?" Lena's voice was small, confused, her 8-year-old brain trying to process why her gift was different, why the other children were staring. That's when something inside me broke. Not cracked, not bent, broke clean in half like a bone under too much pressure. "Nothing, baby," I said, standing up so fast my chair scraped against the marble floor. "You didn't do anything wrong. She'll never be a real Caldwell," Veronica said, her voice carrying across the reception hall like she wanted everyone to hear. "We're just playing pretend here. Some children are charity cases, and some are family." Before I could move, before I could think, before I could protect my daughter from what came next, Veronica raised her hand and slapped Lena across the face. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Lena fell backward, her small body hitting the marble floor with a sound that will haunt my dreams until the day I die. The torn dress scattered around her like broken petals, and for a moment, one terrible, endless moment, she just lay there, too shocked to cry. Then the sound came. Not crying, not screaming, but a keening wail that seemed to come from someplace deeper than her throat, deeper than her chest. It was the sound of a child's heart breaking in real time. "What did you do?" I had never heard Ethan yell before. In 5 years of marriage, through fertility treatments and family tensions and all the small disappointments that accumulate like dust in the corners of a life, I had never heard him raise his voice. But now his words bounced off the crystal chandeliers and silk drapes like thunder in a cathedral. I was already on the floor, gathering Lena into my arms, checking her face where a red handprint was blooming across her dark cheek. Her body was shaking so hard I thought she might fly apart. "It's okay, baby girl," I whispered into her hair, which smelled like the strawberry shampoo she'd insisted on using that morning. "It's okay, Mama's here." But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay again. The reception hall had gone dead silent except for Lena's sobbing and the clink of ice in someone's abandoned cocktail. 200 guests in designer clothes and borrowed diamonds, watching a little girl fall apart on a marble floor. Ethan was standing over his mother, his face white with rage. "You hit my daughter. You hit my child. She is not your child," Veronica hissed, but for the first time, her voice was shaking. "She's a stranger you brought into this family, and I will not pretend otherwise." That's when I saw him, the wedding videographer, a young man with kind eyes who had been trying to capture candid moments of family joy. His camera was still rolling, red light blinking steadily, recording everything. Later, I would learn his name was Marcus, and that he was married to David, Madeline's ex-boyfriend from college. He had reasons of his own for disliking Veronica Caldwell, and he made sure that footage found its way to every local news station in South Carolina. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting Lena out of there. "We're leaving," I said, standing up with my daughter still in my arms. She was getting too big to carry, but adrenaline made her weightless. "Monica, wait." Ethan was beside us now, his hand on my arm. "We're calling the police." "Number." The word came out sharper than I intended. "No police. No scene. We just go. If we don't stop her now, Ethan said quietly, there will be a next time. I looked down at Lena, who had stopped crying but was still shaking. Her eyes were wide and glassy, the look of a child who had just learned that the world was not a safe place. Okay. I whispered. Okay. 20 minutes later, 2 Charleston County Sheriff's deputies walked into Madeline's wedding reception. They were polite, professional, and completely out of place among the ice sculptures and champagne fountains. Mrs. Veronica Caldwell? We need to speak with you about an incident involving a minor. I watched from across the room as my mother-in-law's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, then indignation, then something that might have been fear. She had spent 70 years believing that money and social position made her untouchable. The idea that she could be held accountable for anything, let alone publicly, had simply never occurred to her. This is preposterous, she sputtered, but her voice lacked its usual authority. I am not going to be questioned like some common criminal at my daughter's wedding. Ma'am, we can do this here or at the station, the older deputy said calmly. But we are going to do it. Lena was sitting in a chair nearby, still in her party dress, still holding the torn fabric that had been her gift. A paramedic was checking her face where the handprint was already fading, speaking to her in the gentle voice that medical professionals use with frightened children. Can you tell me what happened, sweetheart? The paramedic asked. Lena looked at me, then at Ethan, then back at the woman kneeling in front of her. Grandma Veronica doesn't like me, she said matter-of-factly. She says I'm not really family because I don't look like everyone else. Then she hit me because I asked what I did wrong. The simplicity of it, the clear-eyed honesty, hit me like a physical blow. This was how my 8-year-old daughter understood her place in the world, as someone who wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite right, wasn't quite family. And how does that make you feel? The paramedic asked. Lena thought about it seriously, the way she approached everything, like the answer mattered. Sad, she said finally. And confused. Because Mama and Daddy tell me I'm their daughter, but Grandma says I'm just pretend. That's when Ethan's father spoke up. Richard Caldwell had been silent for 5 years. A tall man who faded into the background while his wife commanded every room she entered. But now he stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. Veronica, he said, and something in his tone made everyone turn. I let you bully our son when he was young. I stood by and said nothing when you made decisions that hurt him. But I will not watch you destroy that little girl. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after the slap. This was the silence of a family breaking apart in real time. Of secrets finally coming to light. Of a man finding his voice after decades of being overshadowed. You have no idea what you're talking about, Veronica said, but her words sounded hollow. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Richard replied. I've been married to you for 43 years. I know who you are when no one's watching. The Charleston County Family Court building was nothing like the elegant venues where the Caldwells usually conducted their business. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of industrial disinfectant and fear. But it was where Veronica Caldwell would finally face consequences for the first time in her privileged life. The charges were simple. Assault on a minor, child endangerment, and harassment. In South Carolina, hitting someone else's child, even if you're their grandmother, is still a crime. The video evidence made the case straightforward, but what happened next made it extraordinary. Madeline was the first to speak up. My sister-in-law, who had always seemed like a pale shadow of her mother, walked into the courthouse on a Tuesday morning and asked to make a statement. She was still tan from her honeymoon in Italy, still wearing her new wedding ring, but something fundamental had changed in her face. I need to tell you about what it was like growing up in that house, she said to the prosecutor. What came out was a pattern of behavior that went back decades. Madeline described being slapped for acting common, being locked in her room for hours when she didn't meet her mother's standards, being told repeatedly that she was a disappointment to the Caldwell name. She broke my wrist when I was 12, Madeline said quietly. Twisted my arm because I'd been playing with the neighbor's children. They were black, and Mother said it was inappropriate for me to associate with them. We told everyone at the hospital that I'd fallen off my bike. Ethan sat beside me in the courtroom, his face gray with shock. He had grown up in the same house, but somehow, being the golden boy, the heir to the family legacy, had protected him from the worst of it. Other stories emerged. Former household staff members came forward to describe Veronica's treatment of anyone she considered beneath her station. A teacher from Ethan's childhood remembered concerning bruises. Neighbors spoke of screaming matches and children who seemed afraid to make noise. The Charleston elite, who had once competed for invitations to Veronica's parties, began to distance themselves. The story had made national news. Wealthy grandmother assaults adopted child at wedding reception, and suddenly being associated with the Caldwell name was more liability than asset. But the moment that broke me happened during my own testimony. "Tell the court about your daughter's relationship with Mrs. Caldwell," the prosecutor asked. I looked across the courtroom to where Lena was sitting with the victim's advocate, coloring in a workbook and trying to pretend she wasn't listening to every word. Lena tried so hard to make her grandmother love her. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She would practice walking quietly so she wouldn't be disruptive. She learned to say yes ma'am and no ma'am perfectly. She never asked for seconds at family dinners because she was afraid of seeming greedy. She was 8 years old, and she was already shrinking herself to try to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. I paused, looking directly at Veronica for the first time since the trial began. But Lena has something that Mrs. Caldwell will never understand. She knows how to love people without conditions. She knows that family is about choosing each other, not just sharing DNA. She's the kindest, bravest person I know, and she doesn't owe anyone an apology for existing. The judge sentenced Veronica to 200 hours of community service, a year of probation, and a permanent restraining order that prohibited her from having any contact with Lena. It wasn't prison, but for a woman who had never faced consequences for anything, it was a devastating blow to her sense of invincibility. More importantly, the family was finally free. Richard Caldwell filed for divorce the week after the trial ended. After 43 years of marriage, he moved into a small apartment downtown and started volunteering at the literacy center where I'd been working. He and Lena became reading partners, spending Saturday mornings going through picture books together, his patient voice helping her sound out difficult words. "She reminds me of Ethan when he was little," he told me one afternoon, watching Lena practice, writing her name in cursive. Before Veronica convinced him that showing emotion was weakness, Ethan changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. He started going to therapy, working through decades of conditioning that had taught him to avoid conflict at any cost. He learned to speak up, to set boundaries, to protect his family even when it was uncomfortable. We moved out of Charleston, away from the whispers and the weight of family history. Found a house in a small town 2 hours inland, where Lena could ride her bike to school and nobody knew about newspaper headlines or courtroom drama. Lena thrived in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. She joined the school choir, made friends who invited her to sleepovers, started writing stories about brave girls who saved the day. The shadow that had followed her for years began to lift. I started a nonprofit organization called Second Chances, focused on supporting families through the adoption process and fighting discrimination in the system. It turned out there were a lot of families like ours, people who had been told they weren't quite right, weren't quite enough, weren't quite family. We had our first fundraiser on a warm evening in July, exactly 2 years after the wedding that changed everything. Local families gathered in the community center, sharing potluck dinners and stories about the children who had found their way home through unconventional paths. Lena, now 10 and confident in a way that still took my breath away, got up to speak to the crowd. "My first mom couldn't take care of me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My second mom chose me on purpose. She says that's even more special than being born into a family, because it means they really, really wanted you there." That night, after the dishes were done and the last guests had gone home, our little family sat on our back porch watching fireflies dance in the darkness. Lena was curled up between Ethan and me, reading a book by the porch light, occasionally catching lightning bugs in a mason jar she'd decorated with stickers. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked quietly, his arm around my shoulders. I looked at our daughter, completely absorbed in her story, safe and loved and free to be exactly who she was. I thought about the scared little girl who used to sleep on our bedroom floor, afraid we might disappear in the night. I thought about the woman I used to be, who shrunk herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. "Yeah," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy." The fireflies continued their ancient dance, and somewhere in the distance, another family was probably sitting on another porch, learning what it meant to choose each other, to build something beautiful out of broken pieces. To understand that love is not about blood or tradition or meeting someone else's expectations. Love is about showing up. Love is about staying. Love is about saying, you belong here, and meaning it with your whole heart. Lena closed her book and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Mom? She said. Can we do this every night? Just sit here together? Every night we can, baby girl, I promised. Every night we can. And that, I realized, was everything I had ever wanted to give her, not just a family, but the absolute certainty that she would never have to earn her place in it. She was home, and she was ours, and nothing would ever change that again.